They saw one day a pack of vicious-looking humans, mounted on unshod Indian ponies, riding half-drunk through the streets. Bearded, barbarous, clad in the skins of animals, stitched up with thews and armed with weapons of every description. Revolvers of enormous weight, and bowie knives the size of claymores, and short two-barreled rifles with bores you could stick your thumbs in, and the trappings of their horses fashioned out of human skin and decorated with human teeth. The riders wearing scapulars or necklaces of dried and blackened human ears, and the horses raw-looking and wild in the eye, and their teeth bared like feral dogs. And riding also in the company, a number of half-naked savages reeling in the saddle, dangerous, filthy, brutal, the whole like a visitation from some heathen land where they and others like them fed on human flesh. Those are Cormac McCarthy's words in Blood Meridian, as he describes the gang that would dominate the rest of the book. And now they are the focus of this episode, because I learned about the Glanton gang. Before I start, I just want to state that since my initial research, I've only completed a quick read of Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, so my knowledge of the Glanton gang's presentation in the book is based on a very quick read and online summaries. I'm also going to be honest, I'm never going to reread the book in depth. I found Cormac McCarthy a little too depressing for my taste, but that's just me. I have friends who love his stuff. In the book, the Glanton gang is portrayed as a group of vicious, bloodthirsty killers who are scalping Native Americans for profit. However, in real life, they were a group of vicious, bloodthirsty killers who were scalping the Native Americans for profit. Also, before getting too far into things, I just want to say this is really a story of the Glanton gang's final days. There's not a lot out there for their beginnings. The truth is, there's not a lot of information about the Glanton gang out there in general. There are a couple sources, but it's all very light. The only person we can 100% verify exists is the namesake of the gang, John Joel Glanton. His second in command, Judge Holden, is only referenced in Samuel Chamberlain's memoirs. And for those of you who follow me, you'll know I did an episode on Samuel Chamberlain. The episode was solely to highlight the fact that his memoirs are absolutely insane. Chamberlain created a mythology for himself, in which he is America's greatest fighter and lover of all time. I highly recommend that episode, and I highly recommend his memoirs. That being said, everything in his memoirs has to be taken with a grain of salt. However, as I point out in the episode, when Chamberlain talks about the Glanton gang, he gets a little bit more focused and serious. So I don't think he would create this character. I believe Judge Holden existed. As ridiculous as Samuel Chamberlain's memoirs are, he didn't tend to invent people out of nowhere. Plus, Chamberlain served in the Civil War and he was a heroic man, so there's some reason to believe him about the Glanton gang and Judge Holden in particular. Got some good in his column. Plus, the areas I suspected he exaggerated always revolved around him being America's greatest lover and fighter. There is more information for Glanton. He is mentioned in numerous books and articles. However, there are four sources that I relied on heavily for this episode. There's Samuel Chamberlain's book, which I just covered. There's also a book by John Sepich titled Notes on Blood Meridian that gives the historical facts for the people, places, and groups mentioned in McCarthy's book. Sepich does discuss Holden too, if I'm being fair, but he points out the same thing I just did. Only Chamberlain confirms Holden's existence. Sepich's book is amazing because it breaks down all the works written about Glanton. This was vital since I couldn't really locate many of the other works he describes. Also, he did such a fantastic job, I would rather just highlight his work rather than try to recreate it, especially because I'd probably do a worse job at it. Another source is a great article on the Texas Historical Associates website by Ralph A. Smith. So those three sources are huge for helping me understand who these men were and what happened. Finally, there is a deposition of William Carr, which described the final moments of Glanton's life. Carr was there, so obviously a deposition of someone who was there is crucial. But that being said, as you'll notice, even with these resources, it's still a bit of a hodgepodge of what's out there and what we know. Before we get into the story, let's go over the key players. I'm going to start by talking about the already discussed Samuel Chamberlain. I will reiterate that his memoirs are vital. Also, going to take this chance to replug my episode on him. He was born in 1829 and died in 1908. He spent a lot of his time on the western frontier, first as a member of the army during the Mexican-American War, and later just doing odd jobs here and there. During this period, doing those odd jobs, that's when he joined the Glanton gang. After his time out west, he joined the Union Army, in which he was awarded Brevet Brigadier General during the Civil War. So see, he was heroic. Then there's a namesake of the gang, John Joel Glanton. Born in 1819, his life was a wild one. At the age of 16, Lipan Apaches abducted, killed, and scalped Glanton's fiancée. never going to attempt to justify the man's actions later in life because he is not a good guy, but there's no doubt that what happened at 16 shaped him in some way. Not long after his fiancee was killed, he joined the Texas Rangers during the Texas Revolution. Again, he's 16. And after the revolution, kind of just traveled around a bit, getting in trouble. It was reported he got banished from Texas, but that was never enforced. In Louisiana, Glanton was apparently arrested for shooting at a police officer, but since no one was hurt, he didn't receive much of a punishment. Okay. Eventually, he made his way back to Texas, where he was married. Glanton rejoined the military during the Mexican American War, where he served as a scout. His time in the Army was a bit of a mixed bag. He was constantly noted for his heroics, but he had to leave one unit because he killed an unarmed Mexican, then he abandoned his second unit. His third unit went better since his heroics seemed to offset any other issues. When you read about Glanton, it's kind of apparent that this is a man driven by his emotions, controlled by his emotions. After the war, Glanton did what all smart men did in the 1800s when they wanted to make money. He went searching for gold. He left his wife and daughter and went to California to become rich. So then Glanton is stranded in Mexico. I'm not really sure how this happened. Appears to just be poor planning on his part. It's a real shame Glanton never sat down for an interview with anyone. Didn't he know I wanted to do an episode on this? Stranded and needing money, Glanton turned to bounty work. In 1849, the Chihuahua government in Mexico sought someone to help them with the local Apache tribes. Unsurprisingly, Glanton did pretty well at this job. He killed and captured a lot of his bounty targets. But for Glanton, there were never enough targets, so he just started going after peaceful natives, trying to make money off them. When that still didn't get him the amount he wanted, he turned to scalping. He would trade scalps with whoever would buy them for money. There still was a market for them at the time. Chamberlain would report that Glanton received $50 per scalp. Ugly. Here's the thing. Scalping doesn't make you many friends. Glanton found himself with his own bounty, so angered a lot of people, even the traditionally peaceful Yuma. Around the time that he made enemies of the Yuma in 1850, Samuel Chamberlain joined the gang. Chamberlain had great timing since this ended up being right before Glanton's death. However, before getting into Glanton's death, let's talk about Judge Holden. Judge Holden is one of the big characters in Blood Meridian. But like I said, the only historical evidence of his existence is in Samuel Chamberlain's memoirs. Chamberlain did not know where Holden was from, his ancestry, or his past. Rumors in the camp, per Chamberlain, were that Holden's past life was also pretty dark and evil. Chamberlain didn't think too much of him. Chamberlain described Holden as a villain and flat out said that he didn't like the man. Holden was nearly 6 feet tall and deadly accurate with any gun. Chamberlain also tells that there was a dead little girl found in a chapel having been abused, and it's heavily implied that Holden was responsible. Chamberlain believed that Holden was highly educated. Holden could speak multiple languages and knew a lot about geology. This piece almost seems at odds with his other characteristics, which were very rough. But that's all we know about Judge Holden. Real quick, if you're named Judge, you're meant to be a character in something, or an athlete. It just fits. Okay, so we have the big three players out of the way. Let's get into the story. Chamberlain meets the Glanton gang in 1850, and the first time he met John Glanton, Glanton grabbed Chamberlain's nose and twisted it about. Chamberlain claims he responded with violence, knocking Glanton down. But far from being mad, this pleased Glanton, since Chamberlain had passed some crazy test. Chamberlain never found out what happens if you fail the test. Do they just boot you out, or do they do something worse? I'm assuming it's something worse, based on who the Glanton gang was. Chamberlain tells the story of Glanton leaving with some of the men on a scalping expedition. The expedition was deemed a failure because they found no Apaches. However, they did find some Mexicans. They killed the elderly and kidnapped 2 young Mexican girls. Glanton and his men did some very bad things with these girls for the next several days. However, soon after that, a group of local men ironically mistook the Glanton gang for Apaches, attacked them, which unfortunately led to the death of the 2 girls. Chamberlain then tells us of a night where Glanton got drunk and decided to give a speech. However, during the speech, he decided to shoot at the ground in front of his men. He ended up wounding one of them. Things really only calmed down once Holden grabbed Glanton and got him to stop. We talk about the great orators in our history, but no one ever mentions Glanton. I mean, what he did is kind of impressive. He did a speech and started shooting. You know everyone was paying attention. He should have just given speeches for a living. Clearly, he would have thrived. As the gang traveled around, they were attacked by Apaches. I'm assuming by this point, with all the violence, they were known to the natives and had a target on their back. Rightfully so. They got away, but many of the gang were severely wounded. 4 men of the gang were unable to travel further. Chamberlain tells us that Glanton had a rule about leaving wounded men to fend for themselves. Instead of abandoning the men to be found by the Apaches, they killed them. I guess that's a mercy thing, thinking that the Apaches would do worse, I guess. However, the 4 men were beaten to death by their comrades armed with clubs. There had to be a quicker, less painful, less insane way to do that. The gang continued to travel around after that attack. Chamberlain claimed that they were the first white men to ever see the Grand Canyon. Not saying he's wrong, but I'm pretty sure he's wrong. This would fit perfectly with Chamberlain hyping himself up. They weren't the first people traveling west. The gang ends up at the Yuma crossing, home to that peaceful tribe that I said Glanton eventually angered. Well, when the gang moved in, they had yet to anger the Yuma. But soon, Glanton took advantage of the tribe's generosity by stealing several tribe boats and kidnapping 9 girls. Now you understand how he angered the tribe. Initial attempts to reclaim the girls left several Yuma dead. The gang settled in at the crossing and called their setup Fort Defiance. These guys were ridiculous. Fort Defiance seems like the name of a fort that held out for weeks against a stronger army, not a ragtag camp filled with criminals. They spent the next several weeks strengthening their camp at the crossing and ferrying Mexicans over the river. So hey, businessmen. Chamberlain describes one night at the crossing as a disgusting orgy, but thankfully he does not go into detail. Thank God. Chamberlain stated that the actions of the rest of the gang left him and 3 other comrades so appalled that they vowed to leave on the first chance. Decision appeared to be cumulative, not just based on that one night. If you read Chamberlain's book, there's a growing sense of almost like, what did I get into? Chamberlain truly was disgusted by the actions of the gang. Based on what I know about Chamberlain, I believe he is sincere in these feelings. Chamberlain and his 3 comrades timed fleeing perfectly. Chamberlain reported that the Yuma attacked the same morning that the men fled. However, seeing Judge Holden in trouble, Chamberlain decided to save him by firing at the Yuma surrounding Holden, which doesn't make sense to me. Because Chamberlain said he hated him, but I don't know. I wasn't there. Maybe they were comrades for a few weeks and Chamberlain felt like he owed him. I don't know. Holden repaid Chamberlain by stealing his horse and threatening to go to settlements, denouncing the fleeing men as the true villains. Holden fell off the horse. Chamberlain and his compatriots tied Holden and left him for dead. However, Chamberlain once again had a change of heart. I really can't understand Chamberlain at this point. Chamberlain went back and untied him, freeing Holden. Chamberlain left to travel for several days alone to catch up to the other men. Shockingly, 2 days after Chamberlain reached the other men, Holden showed up at the campfire. He had killed a mule and ate it. Chamberlain and his 3 friends kicked out Holden and ate the rest of the food. That's where Chamberlain's memoirs end. There's no description anymore of how he got in trouble and how he wasn't accused of being part of the gang. There's no court hearings on his behalf or anything like that, so we don't know. Chances are he was not known or viewed as part of the gang. So he could just walk away from them. There is absolutely nothing on Holden after his time at the campfire. My guess is he just faded into obscurity. Being that it was 1850, it was a bit easier to just disappear. But you're probably asking, what about John Glanton, the star of the show? Well, there's a few different reports on Glanton's death. I mentioned earlier that John Sepich covers them all excellently, so I encourage you to read his work. I encourage you to read all my sources. There seems to be some agreement among the reports, except for what actually killed Glanton. Some reports have him clubbed to death, while other reports have him killed by a hatchet. Truthfully, I don't think it matters in the end. William Carr's description of events from his deposition from right after everything in 1850 is what most people go by. He states that the Yuma came feigning friendship and cooperation, and they struck when the gang let its guard down. Carr says that he saw Glanton's body tied to dogs and burned. There are a couple interesting things to note about Carr's deposition. First, John Sepich points out, Carr's story is that he and a few others were cutting poles on the day that the event occurred. This activity is exactly what Chamberlain's compatriots were doing before they escaped, which leaves 3 options. One of them is lying. Glanton need a lot of poles. Carr was a member of Chamberlain's group, but lied about his name. There is a 4th explanation out there that Carr's Chamberlain, but Sepich doesn't believe that one. Carr is pretty explicit in that he enjoyed the violence, whereas Chamberlain seems disgusted by it. There is no way of knowing the truth about the discrepancy, so we are just left guessing. But I really don't think Carr is Chamberlain, just doesn't seem to fit. The second thing to note about Carr's deposition is that he has the Yuma feigning friendship. But in Chamberlain's story, the Yuma are angry about Glanton kidnapping some of the girls. So I'm not sure why Glanton would suddenly believe the friendship. I guess it's possible they spin a good story of like, hey, we'll do what you want, whatever. Still, I don't believe it. I'm a little more inclined to think that Carl wanted to be the victim in this scenario. Better to pretend that the Yuma were traitorous rather than responding to the gang's actions. You could definitely get away with this lie, especially in 1850. Either way, the Glanton gang was done. The namesake had died, Judge Holden was gone, disappearing from history, and Samuel Chamberlain was about to serve in the Civil War. I have no idea about the other members or what happened to them. I will say the Glanton gang were not good people, but they were perfect for McCarthy's book. All I know is, when you went to their camp, you could never find a more wretched hive of scum and villainy. Well, that's my episode for today. Probably going to end up being on the quicker side. I just find the Glanton gang fascinating. This group of vicious killers that exist in America, they are very much of their time. They're not really that well known, but they are a star of a book, so that's ironic. I'm always curious on how Cormac McCarthy came across them because they are hard to find details on, yet he seems to get them. But please like, subscribe, do all that fun stuff.